Is a neder a good thing or a bad thing? And there are different kinds of nedarim. Some nedarim are positive, like a person who promises to donate. Some are negative, like the person who swears that they're not going to have a particular item. Good or bad? The Gemara sagt, kla neder, any person who makes a neder, says the Gemara in nedarim, even if the person fulfills their neder, nikra choita, they're considered a sinner. Amr Rabbi Zvid, Maikra, Rabbi Zvid says, what's the pasuk that illustrates this? Because the Torah tells us in our parasha, if you avoid taking a neder, you won't sin. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Zvid says, if you didn't hold yourself back from taking an oath, that is a sin. Also, the Gemara learns a gzeir shava, chadola. The pasuk over here about nedarim says, if you avoid taking a neder. And the other pasuk says, Sham Rishayim Chodlu Roigas. It's a pasuk in Iyah that says, there, the Rishayim will cease from punishment or from anger, depending on which translation you go with. But the point is that there's this Gzera Shava of the word Chodal, or Chadola, and it's associated with a Rasha. Says the Gemara, that any person who makes a neder, even if he fulfills his neder, is called wicked. Not a great advert for nedarim. Now, both of these insights are quoted in the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch, and they're brought practically la halacha. Where the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch say that any person who makes a neder, even if he keeps it, is considered both a sinner and a rasha. We're going to look at the Rambam. The Rambam in Hilchas Nedarim, however, first, he does not quote either of these two insights. What does he do? Brings a different one. He brings a completely different quotation, also from the Gemara Nedarim, for design about what's wrong with making a neder. At the end of Hilchas Nedarim, the Rambam concludes by telling us, any person who makes a promise, it's as if he built an illegal altar for a korban. And if a person didn't listen to this advice, and they transgressed, and they made a neder, immediately they've got to go to the authorities to cancel the neder. So, the obvious question is, why doesn't the Rambam rather quote, as the Torah and Shulchan Aruch do from the Gemara, proofs from Psukim that it's bad to take an oath, that's bad to make a promise? Surely that's what counts. Now, rather he quotes that opinion in the Gemara that says any person who makes a neder, it's like they built a bama. It's one opinion in the Gemara, doesn't have a pasuk. Why choose that one? The other thing is, it's not the first time the Rambam is speaking about avoiding promises. The concept of restraint from taking a neder is something the Rambam discussed far earlier in Hilchas Deos, all about human character. That's where the Rambam speaks generally how a person should conduct themselves in the world. What things we should avoid, what things we don't have to avoid. Look what he says about promises. Therefore the sages instructed that a person should not restrict themselves from things other than the things that the Torah already restricted us. And a person should not take a promise or an oath to prevent themselves from having things that the Torah allows. And the Chachamim gave context to this by telling us, is it not sufficient how many things the Torah prohibited to you, that you're now prohibiting other things to yourself? It's neclatic, so it doesn't make sense. How come there, where the Rambam is speaking about that it's not a good thing to make a promise, why doesn't he quote any of these Gemaras in Nedarim? Why not say you're considered a sinner, considered like building a bomb, etc.? Surely that's a much stronger argument than saying, is it not enough that the Torah already forbade you certain things? So wenn man das verstehen möchte, im Bild von Rambam in der Halacha Anal, to start our process of understanding this, let's go back and analyze what the Rambam said. Kol hanoider ki ilu bona boma. Any person who promises, it is as if they built a bona, illegal altar. If a person ignored that and they transgressed and they made a neder, mitzvah lishol al neder k'dei shelo yehei michshol lefonov. the person immediately has to seek cancellation of the promise. So the promise should not become an obstacle for him. Where does the Rambam get that? The Mokke from the Halacha is the Maimah from Reb Nosson, was gebracht kama piyamim b'shas. He's actually basing himself on a quotation from Rabbi Nosson, which is brought in a number of different mesechtas. And Rabbi Nosson firtois v'haima kaimoi. So Rabbi Nosson goes one step further. He says v'haima kaimoi. If the person then keeps the thing that they promised, in other words, they didn't go have it absolved, and they kept their promise, then not only have they built an illegal bomber, it's like they sacrificed on that illegal bomber. So now's another question. Was bringt nicht der Rambam euch das Sinn von der Maimer? Was bringt noch mehr heraus im Gödel Achet? Eben ist nicht Schelle von Neder. How come the Rambam doesn't finish the quotation from Rabbi Nosson? Because it really shows us, it illustrates how bad it is for a person to make promises. And especially when a person doesn't absolve it and actually fulfills the promise. It's such a harsh thing to say, that if a person keeps their promise, it is as if they have brought a korban on an illegal bomber. Nochmer, beyond that, in Turva Shulchan Aruch, wird das je abgebracht. The Torah and Shulchan Aruch actually do quote that part, yet the Rambam doesn't. Okay, so we're going to see an attempted answer from the Radvaz. The Rebbe will have two strong questions on this explanation, and that will lead us to our next explanation. Radvaz is Masber. So Radvaz wants to say, when Rabbi Nosson in the Gemara says that if a person doesn't absolve themselves of the promise and they keep the promise, it's like they sacrificed on the bama, that depends. Is the Rambam Mefarish Boifen said that Radvaz believes that the Rambam's perspective on that is if the person believes that now that he's undertaken this promise, it's going to trip him up, he's not going to be able to fulfill it, and then he doesn't seek help to get out of it, that's when it's considered like he's bringing this inappropriate korban. But if he's absolutely sure that he's never going to mess up, then the Radvaz believes the Rambam would say, go ahead and fulfill the terms of your promise. Says the Rebbe, two strong reasons why that doesn't seem to be what the Rambam is saying. The Rambam doesn't really seem to fit with what the Rambam is saying. Number one, Aleph, from Pashas the Shein Rambam, let's just read the Rambam at face value. He says, Kol anoider, any person who takes an oath, it makes a promise. It's like he built this illegal bomber. And if a person ignored that and they made an eder, they immediately have to have it absolved. So, at face value, the Rambam was speaking at first about kol hanoider, any person who promises. So then it would imply that when the Rambam continues, anybody who ignores this and keeps their promise, in other words, upholds the commitment to their promise, surely that is in all cases kol hanoider. Sai by Yorei whether he's afraid that it might be an obstacle, or if he's sure that he can handle it. How does the Radvaz see that distinction from the beginning to the end of what the Rambam said? There's another question, a fundamental question. By the way, just one important thing to consider, the Rambam does speak about the advantage of making a promise that will keep a person doing a mitzvah. That's not what we're discussing right now. Second of all, how can a person be absolutely sure that he's not going to mess up his promise? Doesn't the famous Mishnah Pirkavos tell us, Al tamin be'atzmach, never trust yourself till the end? And the Chachamim said, we're not allowed to put ourselves into situations that test us. We daven every single morning. Don't bring us to a test. How can you be so sure? So therefore, we're not going to be satisfied with the Radvaz's explanation. Let's try another perspective. Let's start with the fact that the Rambam said any person who makes a promise is like building a bomber. How come the Rambam does not use the more generic language, which is used in earlier sources, the one who promises? So perhaps the reason the Rambam is saying kol is, the Rambam is mashmashim the halacha, because the Rambam concludes this halacha by telling us that if a person didn't listen and they made the promise, they have to have it absolved. Where are we talking about benidrei isor? If the promise was to forbid himself to do or experience something, But if the person made a promise to make a donation to hektish, then they should still fulfill it. Von dem, was der Rambam macht, zwischen Nidre Isser und Nidre Hektish, nur beim zweiten Fall von wem, it's interesting. At the beginning, the Rambam said, Kol anoider, any promise. Now when he's saying, and if you went ahead and promised, now there's a distinction between the nature of that promise. Was it to restrict yourself or to make a commitment? So if it was to restrict yourself, have it absolved. And if the commitment was to do something positive and to make a donation or to be makdish something, then go ahead and fulfill the requirement, fulfill the promise, and don't seek an escape route. The fact that the Rambam is not applying this across the board to all promises is muchach, that it implies as the erste Indian von Kol HaNeder Ki Lebon Bama is nicht bloß bei Nidre Isser, nor ich bei Nidre Hektish. That implies that the Rambam is telling us two things. If a person made a promise, then it depends. Nidre Isser, sort it out. Get it absolved. Nidre Hektish, go ahead. Make sure you fulfill it. But when he said Kol HaNeder Ki Lebon Bama, then it implies even to make a positive promise like Hektish, that's considered like a Bama. Und also steht befeirish in Prisha. The Prisha says this clearly. He says, what do you mean? The Prisha gave you a mitzvah. Now you have, on top of that, you have to make a promise. As my Rabbi Nosson read, afilu wegen nidei tzedakah. There, the Prisha says that when Rabbi Nosson says it's like building a bomber, that's even if you made a donation, a pledge for a donation. Because even though there's a mitzvah to give tzedakah, when a person over and above that says, I'm going to promise to give tzedakah, it looks like he's adding something. They should give a mitzvah to tzedakah, and I have to do more than that in order to give that tzedakah. As if the Eibishter's instruction is impotent, and I need to add value to it by making a promise. On the Faris Rambam that would explain why the Rambam says that anybody who makes a promise, even if it's a promise for hektish, it is considered like a bomber. Which would also explain why the Rambam doesn't bring the second part of Rabbi Nosson's argument that if you go ahead and uphold the commitment of this promise, then it's like bringing a sacrifice. It's like bringing a sacrifice on the bomber. Because when the Rambam says any person who makes a promise, it's like building a bomber, even if the promise was something really positive, like hektish. Is if the Rambam would mamshach even if korban, because had the Rambam then continued like Rabbi Nosson to say, and if you go ahead with this, it's like bringing the sacrifice on the bomber. That would have contradicted what the Rambam says next. Because what does the Rambam say next? Nidrei hektish, keep it. That it's only if you make a restricting promise that you're supposed to absolve it immediately. But if it is a hektish, a positive donation mitzvah, you have to keep it. And you shouldn't go look for some absolution. And unless there's tremendous pressure, and he quotes the pasuk Nidorai la Hashem ashalem, that if I'm making a neder to Hashem, I have to fulfill it. Now, had the Rambam said that the person who upholds their promise is like they brought a sacrifice on the bama, he could never have said in the same breath, but if it's a neder of hektish, you have to fulfill it. But he said, by the way, this would also explain why the Rambam does not bring this whole issue that a neder could be like a bama in Hilchos Deis. Why? Because there he's talking about a person having, so to speak, personal self-control, staying away from overindulging in the world. But then in Hilchos Deis, he doesn't discuss at all the possibility of making a promise of hektish, of donating something to Kedusha. Okay, so that's a great explanation. That helps us to understand where the Rambam is going, that ideally you never make a promise, because the Eibishter's mitzvahs are good enough, you don't have to add to them. If you made a promise, well, now it depends which. Nidrei Iser, absolve. Nidrei Hektish, go ahead and fulfill it, and that's why you can't say that it's like if you're fulfilling it, you're bringing a carbon on a bomber. Es bleibt aber nicht moving, but there's still a question. If you're telling me that even to make a promise that is so positive like hektish is considered like building that bomber, which I'm not allowed to do, How come the Torah allows the person to keep that promise going? Why doesn't the Torah say, get rid of it? Go absolve it like you absolve Nidra Yisr. The answer is in the language the Rambam uses and the tense the Rambam uses. This concept that taking an oath, making a promise, is like building a bama. The Rambam spoke about it, so did the Gemara. What's interesting is the Rambam only speaks about this in the context of nedarim, not in the context of shavuos, in promises, not oaths. Afalpi as because of Mishnah in Hilchos Nedarim bringt the Rambam Afalpi is bechama mekoimis in Hilchos Nedarim bringt the Rambam zei zusammen an neder anish bechulei. Even though there are many times in the halachas of promises where the Rambam mixes the two nedarim shavuos, they all go into the same expression. Nochme in Hilchos Deis for the Rambam red kanal wegen the chsarim von asron if sich dvarim amutorim, and especially if you go back to Hilchos Deis where the Rambam was speaking similarly to how he's speaking over here about the problem with making promises is a kedel nedarim and shavuos zusammen. There he puts nedarim and shavuos together. So how come over here does he say only nedarim is kilu bana bama kol anoider? Und was ist mochach in Sefer Shavuos, where the Rambam sagt, another illustration of this point is look at the end of Hilchos Shavuos. Look at what the Rambam says. Ideally, a person should never take an oath. Similar language to ours, and he says, and if a person ignored that, and they went ahead and they made an oath, very similar to what the Rambam says at the end of Hilchos Nedarim, if a person transgressed and made a promise. So the Rambam says, well then, you've got to go through the pain of making sure you keep the oath. And he doesn't even suggest that it is like building a bomber. Why? So the Rogatchover points out that there is a fundamental difference between the mechanism of a neder and the mechanism of a shvur that will be reflected in the wording that the Rambam used, which is so important in the tense, and will illustrate this point. The Rogatchover is also mevor. The nature of an oath is that a person places a restriction on themselves as a person. And the prohibition does not in any way attach to an item. Then you can't say it's like you've built a bomber, because I haven't built something, I haven't made something inappropriate, I've just restricted myself. Let's understand what the Rogatchover is saying. In dem Tam Adova, Favos mir sagt, as der was tut an neder is kilu bana bomber, sagt der Ran. So the Ran gives insight into why we associate making a promise with building a bomber. It's the same kind of concept. I'm adding more than what the Torah already said. Nida Beinai says that the reason we compare it to building a bomber is Mishum desolik adate the noider the mitzvah kovid. The person who makes the neder adate the noider. The person who makes the neder thinks I'm doing a great mitzvah. He says, look at the Torah. How many things did the Torah forbid? It's obviously a positive thing. So I'm going to do a mitzvah. I'm going to forbid things to myself as well. Says the Ran, therefore we tell the person, you're mistaken. Not only you're not doing a mitzvah, it's like you're building a bomber. What's the link to a bomber? Yes, the Torah told us that we have to bring korbanos inside the Beis Hamikdash. The same Torah told us it's a beautiful thing to bring korbanos. Don't do it outside the Beis Hamikdash. Yes, it's true that the Torah said that there's certain things that are forbidden. When you think you're going to now add to what the Torah forbade, you are sinning in the same way as the person says, I'm going to add places. Korbanos is such a beautiful thing. I'm going to add more opportunities to do a korban. We say no. And then it uses the same language that the Rambam uses in Hilchos Deos, that the Torah has already, is it not enough how much the Torah is prohibited? You don't have to forbid certain things to yourself. So we can understand this in one of two ways. What is wrong with the person who makes a promise? Is the problem what he's doing as a person? Is the problem that he is adding to his repertoire of things that he's not allowed to have over and above what the Torah said he's not allowed to have? Or is the problem based in the chefza, that he's changed the reality of an entity in this world? And then now, because of his promise, a certain item that previously was permitted is now forbidden. At least in his world, it's forbidden. Something that Torah did not forbid, he now forbids. Same concept in different words. Is the problem the action and the one doing the action? Or is the problem what's being affected by his action? The same would apply even to the promise to give tzedakah or any other promise associated with hektish. Obviously, you're not turning something into forbidden. The money is not becoming forbidden. You could actually apply the same logic here in one of these two ways. Very similar to how we're applying it to promises of self-restriction. One possibility is, what happens over here when a person makes a promise to do something, to give something, to donate something? It's all about themselves. I am now beholden. And maybe that's a problem because the Eibusher gave you a mitzvah called tzedakah. As the Prisha said, you don't have to add to that a promise to give tzedakah. So you don't have to now entangle yourself in a promise to give tzedakah if the Eibusher already said give tzedakah. You don't have to take a promise that the Eibusher didn't tell you to do. Or do we say based on mitzvah nifal? We're actually looking here from the perspective of the impact. His assets are now beholden to tzedakah, which they weren't before. Very similar to the nidrei iser, where we said before, something which was not forbidden, and now you have created a forbidden nature for this thing. Okay, so those are the two possibilities. Are we looking from the perspective of I did something I didn't need to do, or I affected something that wasn't already affected? And that will come back to the specific language that the Rambam versus the Gemara use, as well as the tense of that language. The Rambam says, Kilu bono bama. The person makes a promise, it's as if he built past tense a bama. Nitfin Shulchan Aruch, where the Lashon is Kilu boine bama. Different to the Shulchan Aruch that said if a person makes an inappropriate promise, it's like they are building, present tense, a bama. Shishler Farasha, what does it mean? If I'm saying building, I'm talking about the person, the action that they're doing. It's an inappropriate action. If a person is doing the action of building a bama, that could result in the illegal sacrifice on that bama. It's all about the gavra, the person, and what the person is doing. It's not what the Rambam says. The Rambam says you already made the bono. You've made something exist. You've created an entity which is a bama, an illegal entity. You've made an entity which could later be used for an inappropriate behavior. You're going to see the same precision in the Rambam's language in another expression he used. He says if a person made a promise, they have to have it absolved. Why? In order that the promise should not become an obstacle for him. If we were looking from the perspective of the Radvaz, as the Michshel is that the concern is maybe he'll break his promise, and that's why the Radvaz wanted to distinguish between his level of confidence. So then the Rambam should have said, have it absolved so you don't fall. We could use the language of the Gemara, that he shouldn't come into a bad place. Not the mitzvah, the Rambam saying it's not about the person. As das is nicht mitzad der Gavra, we're not focused on the person and whether or not the person will uphold their promise. Or the person might fail. The entire approach of the Rambam over here is you're creating an entity. And I want to make sure that entity does not land up becoming a hazard for me. That means when the person says such and such is forbidden to me, he has turned that item into something which is forbidden. Therefore, he's turned that item into a hazard, and that's what the Rambam wants to say. You can't create a negative hazard. The Talmud Rambam learned, I say, why is it the Rambam's perspective that we're focused on the item, the nifal, rather than the person, the poil? That's because the Rambam notices that the association of a neder with a bama is not an association that is made by a shvua. Because if this was an issue about the person and the person putting themselves at risk, there would be no difference if the mechanism was a neder or the mechanism was a shvua. But that's the fundamental difference between a shvua and a neder. Well, one of the shvua is about me choosing how I'm going to conduct myself. Neder is about the thing becoming forbidden to me or designated for a purpose. The chilek between the Rambam and Hilchos Deos and Hilchos Nedarim, which also explains why the Rambam takes a different approach in Hilchos Deos versus Hilchos Nedarim. In Hilchos Deos, the Rambam wegen dem Piulas HaGavra. Hilchos Deos is all about human conduct, so it's all about the person. Was es Kedel Kame in Yonim, and that includes many, many things. On Hoibendik von der Hanoga Klolis Shal Prisha Midachei Oilam. That includes the overarching principle, which is we should distance ourselves from the misconduct of the world. That a person shouldn't indulge in meat and wine and just engage in pleasure, etc. The Rambam says that's a bad path. The human needs to avoid that kind of behavior. And if a person ignores that and they go ahead and behave this way, the person is a sinner. And he brings the example of the Nazir, that if the Nazir says that he's not partaking in wine, bad thing. So likewise, the person over here who says he's not going to indulge in pleasure, too much pleasure in the world, therefore he's not going to eat meat, he's not going to drink wine, he's not going to get married, etc. There's too much pleasure in the world. We say to the person, choite. And then beyond that, the Rambam says, don't restrict yourself from things other than what the Torah restricted you from. From that perspective, neder shvur are just mechanisms that achieve the same process. With the Rambam is dort mamshich as the Rambam says there. The theme over there is the person withholding from themselves things that the Torah allows. It makes no difference if he does that through the mechanism of a shvur or the mechanism of a neder. It's irrelevant. Whereas Hilchos Nedarim read the Rambam there, the Rambam is talking from the perspective of the item, which the person through his promise has now turned into a forbidden item. There you're going to say it's like you've built something. This is not about you've restricted yourself, you've made something. It's like you built a bomb. That also explains why in Hilchos Nedarim the Rambam does not speak about the person who makes the promise, even if he keeps it being a sinner, or the Nikra Rasha, or a wicked person. Because Hilchos Nedarim is not about the overarching concept of the common theme between Shavuos and Nedarim, where a person could do something that they shouldn't. We're talking about the specific inside of a neder, which is the effect on things. The whole theme of the Rambam in Hilchos Nedarim is to tell us you have the capacity to make something into forbidden, like the person who can make a bomber. Whereas the fact that a person might be titled a Rasha or Choite, Shem v'Torah Agavra, descriptions of the person, that is not unique to Nedarim, that applies to Shavuos as well. In fact, it even exists in other places, that a person who's fasting all the time, which is a variation on the theme of somebody who's restricting themselves from the world, is called a sinner. That concept, that a person restricting themselves from things that the Torah says they could have, that the Rambam brings in the laws of Deos. In Hilchos Deos, where we talk about human conduct, and therefore the focus is on the person and what the person is doing, isn't doing, should be doing, shouldn't be doing. Then we say, listen, that person who's restricting themselves from the world, choite, sinner. For which reason the Rambam there says that a person should not prevent themselves from things that the Torah allows them. Which includes people who fast all the time. As the Chachamim say, that fasting is a form essentially of self-infliction. Because this also helps us to understand a very significant distinction between the kind of promise that is to restrict a behavior versus the kind of promise which is to make a designation or dedication. If a person makes a promise that that wine, that food, etc. is forbidden to them, the item becomes forbidden. Therefore, the person has created a hazard for themselves. Therefore, the person has to immediately resolve this by going to a chacham, cancelling the neder, so that the hazard is no longer a hazard. Whereas when a person is designating something for holiness, that person is not creating an item which is forbidden. That person is creating a responsibility for something positive, to give tzedakah or to be hektish, etc. So the item is not a hazard. To the contrary, he's created something beautiful. He's created a mitzvah out of this item, in the mitzvah l'kaimen, in which case it is ideal for the person to fulfill the requirements of that mitzvah. That's why we compare it to building a bama. A bama is a structure. It is possible to build that structure without malintention, and then the structure is fine. It's just that when you build that structure, it creates the potential that what goes onto that structure could be forbidden, a korban. But it's not that mitzvah could also be used for something positive. It's a platform for a person to put his father or his Rebbe to sit on as a sign of respect. Or Torah could be a place to read the Torah. Or could be a platform where a person could stand up and inspire the community. As the pasuk says, climb up the mountain and raise your voice, etc. Or could just be something which is completely innocuous. The Rebbe bringt on nicht der Rambam den Pasuk meferish moitzos vasech dishma vas is kasha not dartas. So that's why the Rambam says it's like building a bama. We don't know that it's going to go sour yet. In nidrei hektish, becomes something positive. In nidrei iser, it's going to become a hazard, and that's why you got to absolve it. That's why the Rambam doesn't quote the pasuk that says keep your word. It says that there's a positive mitzvah in the Torah that a person has to keep their promises. Why? But the Rambam sagt früher, something the Rambam discussed earlier. Das ist nicht Dorai la Hashem, das nicht sein eigener Isser v'chiev. Not das ist geworden in la Hashem, der Rebbe is Hashem. Rather, the Rambam wants to say specifically, Dorai la Hashem, in the category of promises that are to give something to tzedakah, to designate something to hektish, there we say, Hashem, you have to fulfill your promise. Bringing that back to this time of the year, Zayin de Nechemta, the 7 weeks of comfort from Tisha B'Av to Rosh Hashanah, the Shvur von the Eibishter, if reinbringen in Eretz Yisrael, on Bechlalev de Geula, the Eibishter made a promise to take the Eden back to Eretz Yisrael, to take us out of Golus. That's something that the Eibishter promised. Not only did he promise us Geula, but he linked it, so to speak, with a promise, with an oath. Not only did the Eibishter make an oath that is, so to speak, binding on him, but he made an oath that is impactful on the world. Because unlike us, the Eibishter's words are active. They create realities. Then the nature of the reality of the world becomes a world that demands that the Eden belong in Eretz Yisrael. Because of the Eibishter's promise to us, the world demands Mashiach. And therefore the minute Yidden do tshuva, is miyad hein nigolen, we're immediately redeemed. And it's there's nothing in the world that could interfere. The other to the contrary, the world insists that Mashiach has to come, and it has to happen immediately.